Hey everyone, welcome back to my podcast, Anatomy and Physiology Bit by Bit. This is your host, Dr. Steve Sullivan, coming to you from Bucks County, Pennsylvania, where I've been teaching anatomy and physiology since 2002. This is episode 50 of Anatomy and Physiology Bit by Bit. Episode 50. It took me a long time to get here because I just don't have the time to put an episode out every single week, and sometimes I take breaks. And there was a really long break around the pandemic time. So we have reached episode 50. Now, I do have more than 50 episodes because early on there were a few bonus episodes. But episode 50. So thank you so much for sticking around. I hope that this podcast is helping you get your B or better in A&P. I've been getting a lot of really nice comments on Spotify about the episodes and about the podcast, and I really do appreciate that. So thank you once again. I want to review a little bit from last episode and talk about the functions of the lymphatic system before we get into the lymphatic tissues and organs. Now remember, this is a crucial part of the body. It supports both immune function and fluid balance. The lymphatic system helps maintain fluid balance by collecting excess interstitial fluid, which is that fluid surrounding your cells, the fluid in between cells, and returning it to the bloodstream. And that prevents the tissue from swelling, which would be called edema. Now remember that in the circulatory system, the capillaries are reabsorbing a lot of the interstitial fluid, but about 15% does not get reabsorbed and go back into the blood plasma. It remains in the interstitial fluid and then gets absorbed by lymphatic capillaries. At that point, it becomes lymph, which is a different fluid than blood plasma, but is mainly about location, right? So when is fluid blood plasma? When is it lymph? Well, it's blood plasma in the circulatory system. It's lymph in the lymphatic system. And there are differences in the concentrations of solutes, one versus the other. But eventually, that lymph gets returned to the circulatory system by way of the subclavian veins. The lymphatic ducts deposit the lymph back into the circulatory system through those subclavian veins, which are found traveling underneath your clavicles, inferior to your clavicles, on their way back to the right side of your heart. The lymphatic system also contributes to immune defense. It plays a vital role in defending the body against infections and diseases. Lymph nodes filter lymph fluid, trapping pathogens, foreign particles, and abnormal cells. White blood cells, specifically lymphocytes, within the lymphatic system identify and destroy those harmful agents. We remember that there are lacteals in the small intestine, and those lacteals absorb dietary fats and the fat-soluble vitamins. Those fat-soluble vitamins are vitamins A, D, E, and K, and they get transported into the bloodstream by those lacteals. The lymphatic system also transports waste products. Cellular waste, toxins, other debris from tissues, all of those waste products get returned to the circulatory system for processing and excretion, which means to get rid of a waste product. And some of the organs that we're going to look at today, like the spleen, the thymus, and the tonsils, are involved in the production, maturation, and activation of immune cells, helping the body recognize and respond to pathogens. We talked a little bit about that the other day. So these functions of the lymphatic system collectively support the overall health of your body by maintaining homeostasis, protecting against disease, and aiding in nutrient distribution. Okay, so let's talk about the lymphatic tissues and organs that are doing the work of the lymphatic system. We're going to start with the tissues. Lymphatic tissues consist of lymphocytes gathered together in a particular region. The human body has internal regions that can be exposed to the external environment. These areas are lined with a mucous membrane and include the respiratory, urinary, digestive, and reproductive tracts. That mucous membrane, or sometimes we call it a mucosa, is a barrier against potentially harmful agents of the atmosphere and is therefore loaded with lymphatic tissue called mucosa-associated lymphatic tissue, or MALT, M-A-L-T. In this case, the lymphocytes loosely collect within the connective tissue region of the mucosa to protect against pathogens entering the body. It is therefore known as diffuse lymphatic tissue. It's also found in several other different organs of the body. Lymphocytes and macrophages come together more densely in structures known as lymphatic nodules or follicles. They're found in the lymph nodes, the tonsils, the appendix, and the small intestine. In the distal region of the small intestine, which is the ileum, lymphatic nodules cluster together to form aggregated lymphoid nodules, also known as Peyer's patches. These provide a more concentrated defense against pathogens that may enter through our digestive system. So when you think about the small intestine, it's actually divided up into 3 parts. The first part, the most proximal, which is the part right after the stomach, is called the duodenum or duodenum. Either way you pronounce it is fine. That's short. It's only about 10 inches long. The second part is called the jejunum, and that is the second shortest part. And then the third part is called the ileum, and the ileum leads into the large intestine, specifically a region of the large intestine called the cecum, and then coming off the cecum in the opposite direction that the contents will move is the appendix, which is a worm-like structure that is a dead end coming off of that cecum. A lot of people think that because you can have your appendix removed when it gets infected, that you don't really need it, doesn't really do anything. But that's not true. The appendix does have lymphatic function. Lymphatic organs are more clearly defined regions of lymphatic tissue surrounded by a connective tissue capsule. There's 2 classes of lymphatic organs, primary and secondary. The primary lymphatic organs are the thymus and the red bone marrow. So the thymus is that gland just superior to your heart that is much larger in fetal development and infancy than it is when you are an adolescent and an adult. It doesn't do as much as we get older, so it atrophies or shrinks. And the red bone marrow is the bone marrow we see in spongy bone. So in between the trabeculae of spongy bone, we have red bone marrow. Those are considered primary lymphatic organs. These are the organs where lymphocytes get their immunocompetency from, which means they differentiate between your body's self-antigens and the antigens of foreign invaders. So when you have an immune cell whose job it is to destroy foreign cells inside your body or viruses, that immune cell has to be able to recognize your cells from the cells that shouldn't be there. And we have on our cells, if you remember way back from the episodes on the cell, we have this glycocalyx and we have these antigens coming off our cell, which we call cell identity markers. Those self-antigens, the antigens that are you, have to be recognized by your immune cells. And antigens that are not you, those are the ones that your immune cells are going to go after and attack. So once an immune cell can recognize your own self-antigens, we call them immunocompetent. They have gained immunocompetency. And they get this in the thymus and the red bone marrow. This is going to help limit the potential of your immune cells attacking your own healthy cells. So when your immune cells are allowed to exist without being able to recognize self-antigens, that means that they might attack your own healthy cells. And that would be an autoimmune disease. Auto meaning self and immune meaning your immune cells. Your immune system's going after yourself. And that's a problem. Some examples of autoimmune diseases are lupus, rheumatoid arthritis. There's a lot of autoimmune conditions and diseases. The secondary lymphatic organs are the lymph nodes. The lymph nodes are about 450 small organs all throughout your body. The spleen is a fairly large organ that is to the left of your stomach, and your tonsils, which are in your pharynx, bilateral tonsils. Only lymphocytes that are already immunocompetent can migrate to the secondary lymphatic organs. So let's start by looking at the primary lymphatic organs, specifically the red bone marrow. If you remember back in previous episodes, specifically episodes 11 and 12, you will see that red bone marrow is found amidst the spongy bone of several different bones and functions in hematopoiesis. Hematopoiesis is the production of blood cells. These blood cells include B lymphocytes and T lymphocytes, which we talked about in previous episodes as well. They're an integral part of the lymphatic and immune systems, and their specific functions we'll talk about in episodes where we cover the immune system. The arteries entering the bones eventually lead to vein-like sinusoids within the spongy bone. They collect the newly formed blood cells before they converge into a central longitudinal vein. From there, the blood leaves the bone via the nutrient or epiphyseal vein and into the general circulation. B lymphocytes fully mature in the red bone marrow, but only about 10% are released into the circulation. 90% don't pass the selection process that determines whether or not they'll be effective and are therefore destroyed right there in the bone marrow. So they don't gain their immunocompetence, and so they are destroyed. Immature T lymphocytes, however, are released into the circulation and travel to the thymus, and that's where they get their immunocompetency. The thymus has two bilateral lobes, a left and a right. T lymphocytes mature in the thymus, which is what the T stands for. The thymus initiates the selection process that determines which T lymphocytes can differentiate between self-antigens and foreign antigens. It also secretes hormones that regulate the activity of circulating T lymphocytes after they've left the thymus. Sometimes we call T lymphocytes T cells. The innermost region of the thymus is called the medulla, which is surrounded by the cortex. The cortex is then surrounded by a fibrous capsule of connective tissue. Extensions of that fibrous capsule continue inward to form septa, or little dividing walls. And they divide the thymus into different lobules. The word septa is plural for septum, which means partition or wall. T lymphocytes that are in the thymic cortex are protected from being exposed to antigens in circulating blood by the blood-thymus barrier. This barrier consists of cortical epithelial cells and the pericytes of capillary endothelial cells surrounding the blood capillaries of the thymus. Once mature enough, those T cells migrate into the thymic medulla, where only 2% complete their immunocompetence tests. That 2% then multiplies and enters the circulatory system or lymphatic system. The remaining 98% destroyed. We don't want T cells floating around our body that are not immunocompetent. The thymus produces hormones called thymosin, thymopoietin, thymulin, interleukins, and interferon. Those hormones participate in the further maturation and activation of T cells. The secondary lymphatic organs are characterized as containing not only lymphocytes, but other immune cells as well. They include the lymph nodes, spleen, tonsils, lymphatic nodules, and the mucosa-associated lymphatic tissue, or MALT. As we follow the path of lymphatic vessels toward the circulatory system, we find hundreds and hundreds of small organs called lymph nodes. They filter lymph, removing any components that we don't want to come back into the bloodstream. For example, pathogens and foreign substances. Lymph nodes are found both individually throughout the body as well as grouped together bilaterally to serve specific regions. Let's talk about some of the regions of our body and the lymph nodes that serve those regions. Lymph from the head and neck goes through the cervical lymph nodes. The axillary lymph nodes are in the armpits, and therefore the breast, axilla, and the upper limb. The inguinal lymph nodes, which are in the groin area, serve the lower limb and the pelvis. Several lymphatic vessels can bring lymph into one lymph node. We call these afferent lymphatics because afferent means incoming. However, it's typical that only one lymphatic vessel carries lymph out of the lymph node, which we call the efferent vessel for outgoing. Lymph nodes kind of look like kidneys in their shape and structure. They have an external capsule surrounding the entire node and an indentation called a hilum in the middle, which is just like the kidney or the lung. The efferent lymphatic vessel emerges from this hilum, just like renal vessels emerge from the hilum of a kidney. The internal lymph node is divided into a superficial cortex and a deep medulla. The narrow space between the capsule and the cortex is called the cortical sinus, and the cortex is divided into several functional regions called lymphatic nodules. These lymphatic nodules are separated from one another by extensions of the cortical sinus called trabeculae. The lymphatic nodules are held together by reticular fibers and contain leukocytes. Each lymphatic nodule is divided into a superficial region called the mantle zone, made up of T lymphocytes, macrophages, and dendritic cells. There's also a deep region called the germinal center, which has B lymphocytes and some macrophages. The lymph-filled space in the middle is called the medullary sinus, and it's divided by connective tissue fibers called medullary cords, which support B lymphocytes, T lymphocytes, and macrophages. Lymph enters from the afferent lymphatic vessels into the cortical sinus, through the lymphatic nodules and into the medullary sinus before exiting via the efferent lymphatic vessel. The pressure gradient created by the fact that there are far more afferent lymphatics than efferent keeps the flow going in that direction. The leukocytes in the lymph node check the lymph for foreign materials and pathogens, and the macrophages dispose of them whenever necessary.
You buy a pair of socks, that's 2 socks. You buy a pair of Bombas socks, that's 4 socks. Because one purchased is one donated. Socks are the #1 most requested clothing item in homeless shelters. So when you buy a pair of super comfortable Bombas socks, you're also donating a pair. Bombas customers have powered over 150 million donations. So Bombas would like to thank you 150 million times. But we only have like 30 seconds. Go to bombas.com and use code AUDIO for 20% off your first purchase. That's BOMBAS.com and use code AUDIO at checkout.
Lowe's knows you've got a job to do, and we help get it done. With the MyLowe's Pro Rewards program, eligible members save more with volume discounts on qualifying orders through a quote of $2,000 or more. Join for free today. Lowe's, we help, you save. Offer can't be combined with any other discount, contract, and/or special pricing. Exclusions, more terms, and restrictions apply. Details at lowes.com/terms. Subject to change.
After leaving the lymph node, the lymph often enters other lymph nodes on its way back to the circulatory system, and then even more lymph nodes after that. The lymphocytes exposed to pathogens often initiate immune responses and begin to multiply in order to shore up our defenses. Some leave the lymph node in search of an infection, but many stay, causing the node to become swollen, a sign of being sick that many people may recognize. The largest lymphatic organ is the spleen. Again, it's in the upper left of the abdominal cavity, to the left of your stomach, a little bit posterolateral, and lateral to the left kidney. Similar to lymph nodes, it has a capsule and trabeculae dividing the functional regions. But rather than a cortex and medulla, the spleen has red pulp and white pulp. The white pulp surrounds a central artery and consists of T lymphocytes, B lymphocytes, and macrophages. The red pulp is made of reticular tissue and contains erythrocytes, or red blood cells, platelets, macrophages, and B lymphocytes. Even though the spleen is a lymphatic organ, its job is to filter blood, not lymph, right? So that's a little bit weird. Blood enters via the splenic artery and eventually makes its way to the central artery of the white pulp. The leukocytes of the white pulp check the blood for foreign substances and pathogens. The blood then enters modified capillaries called splenic sinusoids in the red pulp. The sinusoids are lined with macrophages that phagocytize foreign substances, pathogens, worn-out erythrocytes, and platelets. The sinusoids converge into splenic venules that carry blood to the splenic vein, where it then leaves and re-enters the general circulation. Okay, so the next secondary lymphatic organ is the tonsils. Tonsils don't have a complete capsule, and they're located in the pharynx and oral cavity. There's actually 3 sets of bilateral tonsils: the pharyngeal, palatine, and lingual tonsils. The pharyngeal tonsils are in the nasopharynx, the palatine tonsils are in the posterior and lateral aspects of the oral cavity, and the lingual tonsils are associated with the posterior tongue. The tonsils protect the body against foreign substances that enter the nose and mouth. They're covered by epithelium, and they have crevices called tonsillar crypts. foreign substances and pathogens get trapped in the tonsillar crypts, and then the lymphatic nodules line the tonsillar crypts, helping to process the trapped materials. Infected and inflamed tonsils is a common condition called tonsillitis. Most of the time we see this with the palatine tonsils, and you've probably heard long ago they used to remove the tonsils a lot. They don't do that as much anymore. It was called a tonsillectomy, but they used to do that a lot. Now we have better antibiotics to treat those infections, so we don't see them getting removed as much as we used to. Okay, next we have lymphatic nodules. Every organ in the human body has lymphatic tissue in the form of clusters of lymphatic cells like T lymphocytes, B lymphocytes, and macrophages. These cells are coupled with an extracellular matrix but not completely surrounded by a capsule. The clusters are called lymphatic nodules, which are sometimes scattered about and therefore called diffuse lymphatic tissue. Lymphatic nodules help to defend against pathogens that make their way into these organs. In organs that are open to the outside world, like we see in the gastrointestinal, reproductive, urinary, and respiratory tracts, lymphatic nodules group together within their mucosal membranes to form mucosa-associated lymphatic tissue, or MALT. These tracts are especially susceptible to infections because the pathogens have an easier time getting in than they do in other organs. For example, the small intestine has large areas of MALT that form structures called aggregated lymphoid nodules, or Peyer's patches. They help make sure pathogens that get into our digestive system don't enter the bloodstream and make us really sick. All right, so that's about all I have on the lymphatic system. There is quite a bit there to go over in terms of the anatomy and the function of those structures. So hopefully that helps you with a better understanding of the lymphatic system. The lymphatic system and the immune system are often covered together in an A&P course. So my next episodes are going to get into the immune system, and we'll talk about different kinds of immune function that are really important to any kind of clinician. If you're going to nursing or physical therapy or occupational therapy or any of those positions, you're going to go to medical school, the immune system is a really, really important thing to know about, and the lymphatic system as well. So I hope that this episode has helped you. Once again, thank you so much for listening. Don't forget, if you have any questions, please email me at minus55media@gmail.com, and I will try to answer your questions on an episode. Thanks again. Good luck on your next exam. I'll talk to you next time. Anatomy and Physiology Bit by Bit is a production of Minus 55 Media. Don't forget to check out my Instagram account and my YouTube channel, both called Student Help for AP. I'm posting a lot of stuff on there right now that you can watch and that will hopefully really help you understand this A&P stuff. Very special thank you out to my family, Bucks County Community College, and McGraw-Hill Education, where you can find my tutor video-based textbook alternative Anatomy and Physiology digital suite, already being used by several colleges and universities throughout the United States.